There's a kind of weight that doesn't show, yet it sits on the shoulders of the soul. It makes no sound. It doesn't bleed, but it exhausts you. It's guilt, the kind that never speaks aloud, the kind that smiles outwardly while collapsing inside. No one notices it, but it's there, anchored deep within, reminding you of what you did, what you didn't do, what you could have done differently. It's a quiet voice, yet persistent, one that never lets you truly rest, even with your eyes closed. I remember the day I realized it wasn't just a mistake, it was a spiritual wound. I had failed like everyone does, but what bound me wasn't the past. It was my inability to forgive myself. Guilt doesn't need witnesses, it feeds on silence. And in my silence, that voice grew stronger. I tried to distract myself, to move on, to appear normal. But the soul remembers. You can fool everyone, even yourself for a while, but you can't lie to your own heart. There are nights when the soul wakes you up, not to punish you, but to remind you of what you still haven't healed. It's not cruelty, it's longing for freedom. For a long time, I thought guilt was a form of justice, that carrying it was what I deserved, as if suffering could pay the debt. But years later, I understood. That wasn't justice, it was slavery. Guilt doesn't redeem, it imprisons. It makes you a captive of a past that God already forgave, but you refuse to release. One night, exhausted, I spoke to God in clumsy words. Lord, I don't know how to go on. What I've done, what I've been, it weighs so much I can't even look at you. I expected punishment. I expected silence. But what I felt was something entirely different. A whisper, gentle, almost maternal. Don't hide from me. I'm the one looking for you. That sentence broke me, because all my life, I'd believed I had to hide from God when I failed, that His holiness couldn't bear my misery. But in that moment, I understood that His love doesn't withdraw in the face of guilt. It walks straight through it. He doesn't come to judge you. He comes to rescue you. I cried for a long time, not from fear, from relief. I finally understood that it wasn't God's punishment that hurt me, it was my distance from Him. Because guilt doesn't just remind us of what we did, it convinces us that we no longer deserve love. And that lie is its cruelest weapon. Days, weeks, maybe months passed in which my soul still resisted grace. I wanted to believe in forgiveness, but something inside whispered, "It can't be that easy. You don't deserve it." And then I read a line that changed everything. He who walks away from God because of guilt has not yet understood God. God doesn't expect perfection. He wants sincerity. He doesn't want masks. He wants truth. And truth isn't always clean. Sometimes it trembles, weeps, hesitates. But it's there, in that raw, trembling honesty where He acts. One winter night, while everything was silent, I knelt and said without ornament, "Forgive me, Lord. But above all, teach me to forgive myself." Something shifted. Not instantly, not with fire or signs, but with a soft peace, as if someone had lifted a stone off my chest. I realized that God doesn't erase the past. He redeems it. He doesn't change the story. He changes the storyteller. The mistake remains, but it ceases to be a sentence and becomes a testimony. And that only happens when you dare to look at your guilt through the light of love instead of fear. From that night on, I began to understand that silent guilt doesn't disappear by hiding it, only by bringing it into the light. Because in darkness it multiplies, but in God's presence, it fades. I also learned that the soul isn't freed through forgetting but through truth. And there is no truth more liberating than this. God doesn't love me despite my mistakes. He loves me in the midst of them. That night, I slept differently. Not because everything was solved, but because I finally stopped fighting alone. I fell asleep knowing that the voice that accused me no longer had power, because a stronger one whispered, "You are mine, and I have forgiven you." Understanding where guilt is born was like looking into a well I had avoided for years. On the surface, it seemed simple. I did wrong and I feel bad about it. But when I looked deeper, I discovered something far more complex. The guilt that hurts in silence doesn't always come from sin. It often comes from fear. Fear of not being enough, not being worthy, not being able to fix what was broken. Since childhood, we learn that love is earned through good behavior. If you do things right, you're embraced. If you fail, the eyes turn away. And that human logic, we transfer to God. We start believing His love also depends on performance, that His affection must be earned. But God's love doesn't work that way. He doesn't love because we are good. We become good because He loves us. Silent guilt feeds on that confusion. It's the inner voice that says, if you truly loved God, you wouldn't have failed. But that voice doesn't come from heaven. It comes from fear disguised as devotion, a whisper that keeps you kneeling not out of reverence, but out of shame. And shame, when it becomes prayer, turns into a chain. I began to ask myself, why can't I forgive myself? Why, even knowing that God forgives me, do I still feel stained? The answer was hard to accept, because deep down, I still believed more in my sin than in His mercy. I had turned my guilt into a kind of altar, a place where I unconsciously worshipped my own imperfection. Guilt becomes an idol when we start believing our sin is stronger than His grace. And many live like that, prisoners of a past God has already forgotten, but that they keep revisiting every day as if it were still happening. It's not about denying the mistake, but about refusing to make it your identity. Over time, I understood there are two kinds of guilt, one that comes from the Spirit and one that comes from the ego. The guilt of the Spirit is gentle, clear, and direct. It shows you the error with love, invites you to repent, and leads you to peace. The guilt of the ego, however, is harsh, noisy, and endless. It doesn't seek transformation. It seeks punishment. It doesn't aim for reconciliation. It aims for condemnation. And when the soul lacks discernment, it can easily confuse God's voice with that of the accuser. One night I was reading the Gospel of John and stopped at the words Jesus said to the woman caught in adultery. "Where are those who condemn you? I do not condemn you either." I stared at that phrase for a long time. I do not condemn you. How much tenderness and truth are hidden there. In those words, I understood something fundamental. Jesus doesn't deny the mistake. He destroys the condemnation. He separates the action from the value. He says, in essence, yes, you failed, but you are still worthy of love. That's when I understood why my guilt had been so persistent, because I had become my own accuser. I had replaced the voice of forgiveness with the voice of judgment. I punished myself in the name of morality, without realizing that true repentance doesn't seek to pay, it seeks to return. Spiritual guilt heals when it becomes a path back home. Egoic guilt, however, sickens. It traps you in a loop of self-hatred. And the more you judge yourself, the further you drift from the only source that can heal you. Days went by in which I began to observe my own thoughts. Each time the voice of reproach appeared, I confronted it with a single truth. I am not my mistake. I repeated it over and over, until something inside me began to believe it. I realized that guilt feeds on complicit silence. If you don't face it with love, it controls you. But when you look at it through light, it loses its strength. Guilt is born in darkness, grows in fear, and dies in truth. I also started to understand its emotional roots. Guilt doesn't always come from something we did. Sometimes it comes from something we think we should have done. It's the burden you carry when you believe you could have saved someone, avoided harm, made a different choice. It's the weight of, if only, that haunts the soul like a ghost. But we are not gods. Not everything that goes wrong is our responsibility. When I accepted that, I finally breathed freely for the first time in years. I realized that much of my guilt came from trying to control what was never in my hands. And there I understood another truth. Guilt is often pride in disguise. We think we're so important that everything depends on us. But when you surrender control to God, guilt begins to loosen its grip. That revelation was immense relief. I discovered that humility isn't bowing your head. It's admitting you can't save yourself. There is no mistake too great that His love cannot redeem. Grace cannot be earned. It can only be received. And with that understanding, guilt began to lose its shape. It stopped being punishment and became message. It was no longer the voice saying, "You are unworthy." It became the whisper that said, "Come home." But guilt doesn't only live in the soul. It settles in the body. It hides in your muscles, in your chest, in your stomach. It's that knot that won't go away, that pressure that stays even when you laugh. It's the constant tension of someone who fears being discovered, even when no one is searching. Over time, I realized I wasn't just carrying an emotion. I was living in a posture bent inward. Every thought was colored by that shadow. When someone looked at me, I imagined they saw my failures. When someone praised me, I felt I didn't deserve it. When something good happened, I waited for punishment to follow. Guilt had corrupted the root of joy. It taught me to distrust every blessing. It was as if a sleepless judge lived within me, one who found faults even in moments of peace. That inner voice, subtle yet cruel, never shouted. It whispered, "You know what you did." And those words alone were enough to silence any attempt at hope. I didn't understand then that the voice of God doesn't humiliate, it restores. It doesn't sink you, it lifts you. It doesn't paralyze, it invites. But when the mind grows accustomed to punishment, it starts confusing love with discipline and grace with debt. There were days when my soul simply collapsed. I felt empty, unable to pray, as if my words bounced against an invisible ceiling. I thought God had withdrawn from me, when in truth I was the one who had hidden behind my fears. Because that's what guilt does. It builds walls of shame between you and the light, not because God has left, but because you've convinced yourself you no longer deserve to approach Him. I remember an afternoon when I decided to walk into an empty church. I wasn't looking for answers, I was looking for rest. I sat quietly before the altar, unsure of what to say. The light was soft, the air still, and the echo of that sacred space surrounded me like a sigh. And there, in the silence, I felt something. Not the voice of reproach I expected, but a presence looking at me with tenderness. A soundless voice whispered, "I didn't come to remind you of your guilt. I came to give you back your peace." I wept, and with every tear, a portion of the weight dissolved. It was then I understood that forgiveness isn't a rational act, it's a spiritual one. It's not about saying I forgive myself and moving on. It's about letting God's love reach where you cannot. From that day, I began to notice the physical effects of letting go. I slept better. I breathed deeper. My body felt lighter. The guilt hadn't vanished entirely, but it had lost its throne. There was room for something new. Hope. I started to practice a simple, almost childlike prayer, yet it carried power. "Lord, teach me to accept that you've already forgiven me." That phrase transformed my relationship with Him, because sometimes accepting forgiveness is harder than asking for it. It's easier to believe in sin than in grace. But the soul heals only when it accepts being loved even in its cracks. Over time, I discovered that prolonged guilt has a corrosive effect. It turns self-love into self-contempt. We become our own executioners. We punish ourselves with cruel thoughts. We deny ourselves joy. We sabotage opportunities. It's as if we unconsciously wish to keep suffering to prove we've paid enough. But suffering was never the currency of forgiveness. The only currency is faith. Faith that grace is real, that Christ's sacrifice was enough, that love doesn't need proof of worthiness, that faith doesn't impose itself. It grows slowly, quietly. And each time I chose to believe, even just a little, guilt retreated. I also learned that confession isn't weakness, it's release. The soul frees itself from its own echo when it dares to speak. When guilt is hidden, it rots. When spoken, it heals. I don't mean confession only before others, but before God, before yourself. Truth, when spoken aloud, stops being a prison and becomes a path. I began to write what I felt, sometimes just a single line. Today, I forgive myself a little more. Other days, pages of sorrow, regret, and hope, and with every word, something loosened. My soul spoke, and God listened. Without reproach, without a list of faults, only listening. One day, while meditating in silence, a thought struck me like light through fog. Remorse comes from fear. Repentance comes from love. The first keeps you bound, the second sets you free. And I understood that true repentance isn't saying I failed, it's saying I want to return. That was the beginning of my true liberation, because guilt, when it transforms into the desire to come home, ceases to be a burden and becomes a road. Little by little, the inner voice began to change its tone. It no longer said, "You don't deserve happiness." It began to whisper, "Look how much you've learned." It no longer accused, "You're unworthy." It began to remind, "You are loved." And that change didn't come from me. It came from God, because only His love can transform condemnation into consolation. The soul that forgives itself begins to heal, and the soul that heals learns to love again. The real transformation began the day I stopped fighting against my guilt and started listening to what it wanted to teach me. Not everything in it was an enemy. Some of its messages asked for attention, others for tenderness, and some simply wanted rest. I realized that guilt wasn't an eternal sentence. It was a door I had been afraid to open. I started to look at it differently, not as a shadow, but as a teacher. I understood that at its core, guilt is a sign that the soul longs to return to love. It's the reminder that we still have a conscience, that our hearts haven't grown completely numb. What's dangerous is not feeling guilt, it's deciding to live inside it. Because the soul was never meant to drag weights, it was meant to learn from them and move on. One day, while walking through a park, I saw a little boy trip and fall. He scraped his knee and began to cry. His mother rushed over, lifted him gently, cleaned the wound, and said, "It's all right, my love. It was just a fall." The boy nodded, wiped his tears, and went back to playing. I stood there watching, and suddenly, I understood. That's how God is. That's what grace looks like. We fall, we cry, we punish ourselves, but He only wants to lift us up and say, "It's all right, go play again." That thought changed everything. Because for years, I had believed that my fall disqualified me, that my stumble stripped me of the right to run again. But that's not how God works. He doesn't seek perfection, He seeks relationship. He doesn't wait for you to come clean, He waits for you to come willing. From then on, I began to live differently. Every morning before leaving home, I said a short but deep prayer. "Lord, help me live today without fear of failure. And if I fail, remind me you are still here." That prayer became my shield. It let me walk without the burden of guilt, because I finally understood that even my mistakes could be used for something good. I also learned that guilt never completely disappears. It transforms. It's no longer a condemning voice, but a compass. When I act far from love, I feel it as a soft discomfort, a gentle call to return. But it no longer crushes me, because the difference between guilt that destroys and guilt that teaches lies in the eyes through which you see it. I began to reconcile with my story, not only with recent mistakes, but with the ancient ones, the ones hiding in the corners of the soul, the ones you avoid looking at. I faced them with gentleness. To every painful memory I said, "Thank you for what you taught me." And I felt how the past began to lose its power. Because forgiveness doesn't only cleanse the present, it heals the memory. To look back without pain is one of the purest forms of freedom. Because you are no longer a slave to what you did, you become the guardian of what you learned. It was then that I understood forgiveness as a form of spiritual intelligence. It's not about forgetting what happened, it's about seeing it from a higher consciousness. From the point where you realize that even what broke you was part of the path toward awakening. Guilt had been my shadow, yes, but it had also been my teacher. It taught me to be more compassionate with others, to judge less harshly what I don't understand. Because behind every action there's a story, and behind every story, there's a soul searching for love. Sometimes when I see someone drowning in their own remorse, I feel the urge to tell them what I once needed to hear. You are not defined by your mistake. You are not what you did on your worst day. You are what you do with it today. And it's true. Grace doesn't erase the past. It rewrites it in a new light. Gradually, I began to feel something new. Lightness. Not euphoria, but peace. The peace of knowing I no longer need to justify myself or carry the cross that Christ already bore for me. I began to understand that accepting grace isn't arrogance, it's humility, because recognizing that you cannot save yourself is the most honest act of self-love that exists. One night while I prayed, I remembered my old words. I can't look you in the eyes, Lord. But this time in my heart, I saw him smile. Not because I deserved it, but because he understood. I felt him say, "At last you're learning. Love is not something to deserve, it's something to receive." And at that moment, something in my soul was completely freed. The guilt that once haunted me now walked beside me, not as a weight, but as a witness, as a story I could tell, so that others might find hope too. Because when you discover that God's forgiveness has no limits, your heart becomes merciful. You no longer condemn anyone, because you know what it means to be set free. You no longer point fingers, because you know what it's like to be lifted up. True transformation of the soul doesn't happen when you stop failing. It happens when you stop doubting the love that holds you even when you fail. When the soul is freed from guilt, something miraculous happens. It begins to see the world with new eyes. The same eyes that once saw judgment now see humanity. Where suspicion once lived, compassion begins to grow. Because only those who have known the weight of guilt truly understand what it feels like to be lifted with tenderness. For a long time, I believed guilt was something between God and me alone. But I soon realized that its healing wasn't complete while I still held resentment toward others. Guilt had made me more aware of my own errors, yes, but it also taught me to see the errors of others with mercy. Not because I excused them, but because I understood their roots: fear, pain, ignorance, and wounded love. One day, someone came to me and asked for forgiveness, for an old wound that had left a scar in my life. I listened, and to my surprise, I felt no anger, no pride, only peace. I heard myself saying words that flowed from somewhere deeper than thought. "It's all right. You don't have to carry that anymore. What happened, happened. God already used it for good." Those words weren't rehearsed. They came from my soul. And as I spoke them, I understood something profound. Forgiveness doesn't only free the other person, it frees you. Because a heart that holds resentment forges new chains around itself. And I had learned too much about chains to create more of them. I learned that forgiving doesn't mean approving what happened. It means refusing to remain enslaved to it. It means letting God's justice be greater than your need to be right. It means choosing peace over pride, love over memory. There were days when I even felt compassion for those who had hurt me. Not because they deserved it, but because I realized that the one who hurts is also hurting. The one who lies is running from his truth. The one who betrays is afraid of being betrayed. And in that realization, something within me changed. I stopped seeing enemies. I started seeing souls. The guilt that once dragged me down had turned into empathy. It made me more human, more patient, more aware of the fragile bond that unites us all. I understood that there is no life without mistakes, no mistake without the possibility of redemption, and that God, in his mysterious wisdom, uses even our failures to teach us how to love. One afternoon, while walking through the city, I saw a young man sitting on a bench crying quietly. I approached him gently and asked if he was all right. He didn't know me, but he began to talk. He told me about his error, his remorse, the weight that was crushing him. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I looked at him and said softly, "I've been there too, and I promise you, this is not your end." His eyes filled with tears, and in that instant, I knew all my pain had not been wasted. Because my story, the one I had once wanted to forget, now serve to heal another. That's when I understood something essential. What God redeems in you, He returns as mission. Forgiven guilt becomes ministry. Healed wounds become balm. I began to speak more openly about my journey, not with the pride of someone who has overcome, but with the humility of someone still learning. I discovered that when you share your shadows, you illuminate those of others. When you speak of your guilt without shame, you help others face theirs without fear. And from that moment, a deeper kind of peace was born within me. Not passive peace, but living peace. It was no longer enough to be free myself. I wanted to help others find freedom too, because I had understood that true freedom is never solitary. It spreads. Whoever has been set free from guilt inevitably desires to liberate. That became my new prayer. Lord, let my story serve. Let what broke me become seed for others. Let where I fell become ground where someone else learns to rise. From then on, guilt stopped being a painful memory and became a soft melody, another note in the symphony of the soul. Because everything, even error, can become art when touched by the hands of God. Sometimes when my mind tries to recall old wounds, I smile. I no longer defend myself. I no longer argue. I simply whisper, "That's already forgiven." Because human memory often forgets what divine mercy has already erased. And in that awareness, my life became lighter, quieter. I no longer feared stumbling, because I knew that every fall carried a purpose. I no longer feared the judgment of others, because I knew I had been absolved by the only judge who truly matters. Forgiveness didn't change my past, but it changed the way I walked toward my future, and that changed everything. There comes a moment in every spiritual journey when the word guilt stops hurting, not because you've forgotten what happened, but because you finally understand what it meant. Everything takes on new meaning. The falls, the silences, the tears, the sleepless nights. Every fragment of pain becomes part of a larger invisible design, woven with the patience of God. And there, in that new perspective, guilt ceases to be a chain and becomes a witness. I remember the first time I felt His forgiveness for real. It didn't happen during Mass or in a spectacular prayer. It happened on a simple afternoon, as sunlight filled my room. I sat in silence, asking for nothing. And suddenly, a gentle peace surrounded me. It wasn't external. It rose from within. It wasn't emotion. It was certainty. The certainty of being loved even when I had already given up on myself. From that day on, I understood something that changed me forever. God doesn't forgive us to make us forget. He forgives us to help us remember without fear. Forgiveness doesn't erase history. It redeems it. Because the very place where we fell becomes the altar where we learn to love. As time passed, I began to notice how my once burdensome guilt had turned into sensitivity. Where I used to judge, I now understood. Where I once stayed silent out of shame, I now spoke with tenderness. I learned that guilt, once healed, becomes a moral compass deeper than any rule. It reminds you, without condemning, of the power of empathy and the beauty of humility. With each passing day, I realized that there is no greater liberation than accepting that God's grace doesn't require our perfection, only our surrender. That small, sincere yes we utter when we finally stop fighting ourselves. That's where the silent miracle begins. The weary soul stops defending itself and allows itself to be embraced. One night, while gazing at the sky, I remembered how many times I had asked God, "Why did you let me fall?" And the answer came, not as a voice, but as a realization. I didn't let you fall. I let you learn how to return. A shiver ran through me. I understood that His love isn't measured by the absence of falls, but by His unwavering presence in the middle of them. Today, I can look at my mistakes with serenity. I don't deny them. I don't justify them. But I no longer carry them either. They are part of me, but they no longer define me. They're chapters of a greater story, the story of a soul that, Having reached the bottom, learned to float in mercy. Forgiveness also taught me to delight again in simplicity. A sunrise, a hug, a genuine conversation. Before, all of that was clouded by guilt. Now every moment feels like a gift. Because when the soul is freed, it rediscovers wonder. And when it rediscovers wonder, it begins to live in gratitude. Gratitude is the purest form of prayer. It doesn't ask, it acknowledges. It doesn't demand, it contemplates. Each morning I wake up and say, "Thank you, Lord, for letting me fall just enough to find you waiting for me on the ground." And I say it without sorrow, because now I know that it was on the ground where I met his closest gaze. I've come to understand that guilt in the end was a language, a way God spoke to me. When I wouldn't listen to love, he spoke through pain. When I couldn't understand tenderness, he spoke through emptiness. And when I finally responded, there was no reprimand, only embrace. There is no soul too broken to be rebuilt, no error so grave that it cannot become wisdom, no guilt so ancient that it cannot be held in mercy's arms. If I've learned anything from this journey, it's that God's forgiveness doesn't wait at the end of the road. It is the road. Every step we take toward light is already sustained by his grace. Now when I look back, I don't see ruins. I see foundations. I don't see a condemned soul. I see a heart that learned to love through its own wounds. And that is the most beautiful thing about divine love. It doesn't just cleanse you, it transforms you. When people ask me how to free themselves from guilt, I no longer give theoretical advice. I simply tell my story. I tell them that the process isn't quick, but it is real. It begins with a humble confession. I can't do this anymore. And it ends with a revelation so immense it silences everything else. I was never alone. Because that is the greatest truth of all. God's love doesn't depend on our purity, but on his promise. And his promise is eternal. Now, when life brings new trials, when shadows from the past try to reach me, I no longer run. I close my eyes and remember, that has already been redeemed. And that phrase is enough, because a soul that has tasted grace no longer fears the dark. It knows that even there the light is waiting. If you ever feel the weight of your guilt again, don't flee. Sit with it, listen to it, let it show you what you still haven't surrendered. And when you're ready, give it to God. He won't demand explanations, he'll offer rest. And then you'll understand, as I did, that guilt was never the end. It was the door that opened so grace could enter.